Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg Levine, head of the Life Sciences Regulatory and Compliance Practice Group at Ropes & Gray, based in our Washington, D.C. office. Thank you for joining us today for the second installment of our Transition Tuesdays series, in which we are beginning to explore the consequences of the 2020 election for regulated industries. Today, we're focused on the healthcare and life sciences industries. I'm joined by several of my colleagues from our Washington, D.C. office, Kelly Combs and Beth Weinman, both of whom focus their practices on FDA regulatory matters, as I do, and Margot Hall from our healthcare group, who focuses on drug pricing regulation. We have a short session today, only 30 minutes, so we're going to be providing relatively brief thoughts on emerging developments. In late January, we will have our annual Life Sciences and Healthcare Outlook event, which will be longer and more in-depth, and by that time, we should have more information to comment on, of course, regarding what's already occurred during the transition and then what to expect in 2021. One topic today that we won't be in a position to comment on in detail is the leadership changes that will occur at the key agencies affecting healthcare and life sciences companies, most notably the Secretary of HHS, which is a cabinet level position, as well as the heads of CMS and FDA. All of those positions require Senate confirmation, and therefore the political considerations will need to be taken into account in what is going to be a closely divided Senate, regardless of what happens with the January Senate runoffs in Georgia. There have been some rumors, some information in the press that's been reported looking at the membership of President-elect Biden's new coronavirus task force or the transition team personnel, looking back at who the agency leaders were under the Obama administration and others, but really nothing concrete to go on at this point. Certainly the trend in President-elect Biden's nominees has been towards technical competence. In the Biden view, restoring faith that the agencies are going to make public health decisions based on science, as well as a focus on racial and gender diversity. So I think we'd expect to see much of those same priorities in these decisions for personnel under the new administration. But by late January, when we do our next program, we should know a lot more on that. So with that as an introduction, I'll turn the conversation over to Margot to share her thoughts on drug pricing.
Sure, thanks, Greg. So I'm a partner in the Ropes & Gray Healthcare Group based in Washington, D.C. And as Greg mentioned, I focus much of my practice on drug pricing and market access questions. Drug pricing is a topic that has been front and center in the news cycle for the past several weeks during the transition process. And I anticipate that it's going to remain front and center for the next 4 years and likely beyond that as well. Up until a few weeks ago, most of the Trump administration's efforts around drug pricing had fallen flat due to legal or political obstacles. However, in the past few weeks, we've seen a flurry of last-minute final regulations that stand to dramatically change drug pricing arrangements and drug price transparency. So in late October, a final rule was released that requires certain health plans to disclose to the public, starting in 2022, first, the negotiated price that the insurer has agreed to pay a particular in-network provider for a drug. And then second, the historical average price a plan paid for the drug, inclusive of rebates or price concessions. This is a dramatic change when it comes to drug price transparency, given that rebate and discount information is regarded as highly confidential and proprietary, and historically has been protected from disclosure under various federal laws. And then most recently, on November 20th, we saw several rule releases. One of those rules, released by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, implements a nationwide most favored nation payment model for various Medicare Part B drugs in the Medicare fee-for-service program. That rule was released as an interim final rule, bypassing the typical notice and comment rulemaking process, and it is set to go into effect January 1st in just 31 days. So on January 1st, CMS will begin a 7-year demonstration project that will apply on a nationwide basis. It will include all providers and suppliers that receive separate payment for one of the model drugs with limited exceptions. And for the first year of the model, CMS has selected 50 separately payable Part B drugs and biologicals that contributed the most to Medicare Part B program drug spend. And the interim final rule lists those drugs. You can also find a link to the interim final rule as well as more detailed analysis in an alert that we published about a week ago. But under the model, a drug's payment amount will be based on the lowest available GDP adjusted price for the drug from a list of countries that meet minimum GDP requirements. So this is not an averaging or a weighting of different international prices. It is the lowest available price after applying that GDP adjustment from the list of countries. And for the first performance year, there are 22 countries on that list. So what does this mean for the Biden administration? Well, I anticipate that the most favored nation interim final rule will be subject to legal challenge on both procedural and substantive grounds. And other recent rules might be tied up in litigation as well, although many of those are not scheduled to go into effect until 2022. In general, the Biden administration is likely to take reactive steps to certain Trump administration regulatory actions, including potentially postponing rules that have been published but that are not yet effective, or using the notice and comment, rulemaking process to issue its own regulations that functionally rescind Trump era regulations. But all of those steps assume that Biden would want to unwind the Trump era regulations. And for some of these drug pricing related regulations, that's a big question mark in my mind. There also is the looming question of the balance of power in the Senate. Until the Georgia runoff races are decided, we will not know whether the Biden administration will have to contend with a Republican-controlled Senate. If Democrats take back control of the Senate, you can imagine the Biden administration will have, a much broader range of legislative options available when it comes to addressing drug pricing. And also in the more immediate term, the administration could seek to use the Congressional Review Act to unwind certain regulatory actions of the Trump administration. On the flip side, if Republicans retain control of the Senate, then there's real skepticism regarding whether the Biden administration and the Senate can develop a consensus approach around drug pricing. We know that everybody wants to address drug pricing, but there's a divergence of views in terms of how to do so. And that may limit the feasibility of any legislation that would address drug pricing, leaving the Biden administration with executive orders and general regulatory approaches to address the topic. In that case, the Biden administration will have limits to what changes it can successfully implement through regulation within the confines of existing federal statute. But I expect that his cabinet will closely scrutinize and seek out opportunities for regulatory change. We know that Biden has an ideological commitment to addressing drug prices. He has raised various ideas and proposals over time, including the topic of directly negotiating drug prices in connection with the Medicare program, and this general approach of linking the pricing or reimbursement of drugs in the US to international pricing has been embraced by many Democrats, as we saw in H.R. 3, a Democrat-backed bill that proposed its own conceptually distinct approach to international reference pricing. And finally, let's not forget the states. The states have proven themselves to be laboratories of innovation when it comes to drug price transparency, and states have had their own set of elections. Many state legislative sessions were postponed due to COVID-19, but as they resume, I expect that states will continue to introduce an increasingly complex tapestry of drug price transparency legislation that's going to require close vigilance from a compliance standpoint. There's much more I could cover on this topic, but the same is true for all of the other topics we're addressing today, including developments within the FDA with respect to drugs. And so I'm going to turn it over to Kelly Combs in our FDA group to address that topic.
Thanks so much, Margot. As with drug pricing, some of the most crucial developments related to COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics are actually expected to occur before the inauguration. And let's start by talking about the vaccine candidates. Pfizer and Moderna now have both submitted requests for emergency use authorization for their mRNA vaccine candidates, and meetings of the Vaccines Advisory Committee have been scheduled for very soon. So Pfizer's meeting scheduled for December 10th, and the Moderna meeting scheduled just a week later on the 17th. We can certainly expect, I think, prompt action from FDA following the advisory committee meetings. But while some in the current administration have suggested that authorization and ultimately distribution could happen as soon as a day or two after the advisory committee meeting, FDA has been more judicious and has attempted to walk that back. So for example, Peter Marks, who heads the FDA Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, has attempted or has clarified that the agency's goal is to make sure that authorization occurs within a few weeks, but that it's important that the process not be rushed. Interestingly enough, Commissioner Hahn was reportedly called to the White House for a meeting just this morning to meet with the president's chief of staff. Media is reporting that the meeting was called due to White House frustration with FDA foot dragging over the vaccine timeline. The commissioner subsequently issued a press release defending the timeline, emphasizing that the review process is complex and that the agency's scientists need sufficient time to review all the data. That's consistent with the commissioner's prior statements, where he's made clear that the exact timing for authorization will depend on the complexity of the data and the extent of the advisory committee's feedback. In any event, EUA decisions on these two vaccine candidates seem likely to come either before or around the end of the year, with distribution beginning quickly after FDA authorization. So what happens in 2021? With the vaccines in particular, we'll likely see more companies like Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, and Novavax, just to name a few, submit for emergency use authorization as additional data are generated on those product candidates. Subsequent to emergency use authorization, FDA has made clear through guidance that the agency expects sponsors to continue collecting placebo-controlled data and any of its ongoing trials, so long as it's feasible to do so. And the agency has also made clear that it expects sponsors to ultimately be working toward a full approval through a biologic license application as soon as possible. Now, the timing, all of this remains to be seen, of course. And while FDA is currently reviewing the vaccine EUAs at lightning speed, query whether the agency can really maintain that rapid pace once it has several applications to consider. Now, at the macro level, with respect to vaccines and therapeutics, both Biden and Harris have made clear, as Greg alluded to earlier, that it's important to have science-based decision-making at FDA. Both of them have expressed concerns previously that political influence was potentially undermining public trust in the agency. As a result, I think we can continue to expect from the new administration a lot of deference to the career scientists, medical professionals at the agency. And I doubt we'll see a real sea change in terms of authorization or approval standards. That said, agency guidance, I think, is certainly expected to evolve just as we learn more about COVID-19 and as additional data are generated on the vaccine and the therapeutic candidates. So let's switch gears for a moment and talk about FDA's intended use rule. In September of this year, the agency proposed to revise the intended use regulations for drugs and devices, the most recent regulatory action in what's quite a long saga that began back in 2015. Now, the intended use definitions are critically important because they govern when a medical product manufacturer may be seen as promoting a new intended or off-label use of its product. And the regulations have long been controversial for a variety of reasons. Among other things, the text of the current regulations suggests that mere knowledge that your product will ultimately be put to an off-label use can be sufficient to create a new intended use for the product. Additionally, there's ambiguity in the current regulations about when, if ever, the government can look to other sources of evidence aside from promotional claims like internal company documents, or more importantly, non-promotional safe harbor speech to determine whether a new intended use can be imputed to the manufacturer. In 2015, responding to requests from industry, FDA proposed to revise the intended use definitions just to remove that reference to knowledge, attempting to clarify that knowledge of off-label use without more cannot subject a company to penalty. When the agency finalized the rule, though, in the last days of the Obama administration, FDA not only removed the knowledge prong of the intended use regulation, but also overhauled the regulation in its entirety, essentially taking the position that the government can consider, quote, the totality of evidence in determining intended use. So very different from what was initially proposed. Industry groups, including pharma, bio, and the Medical Information Working Group, which is a consortium of about a dozen pharma companies, submitted a petition to FDA to stay and reconsider that rule because the final rule dramatically departed from the proposed rule, and also because that totality of the evidence standard was overbroad and unconstitutionally vague and inconsistent with the agency's statutory authority. Most important, such an overbroad interpretation of intended use can chill very important scientific and medical communication about off-label uses of products from ultimately getting to the doctors that need the information to treat their patients. So over the next year or so, through a series of pronouncements, FDA delayed and ultimately abandoned that final rule and the totality of the evidence standard. And the new intended use rule that came out, proposed in September, really came as a surprise to many of us, I think, in terms of timing as well as substance. Now, in some ways, the proposed amendments to the regulations are welcome. The agency renewed its position that knowledge alone cannot be sufficient to create a new intended use. And FDA also clarified in the preamble to the rule that manufacturer communications that clearly fit within an established FDA safe harbor, such as the reprint guidance or the guidance on communications consistent with the labeling, will not be regarded as evidence of intended use. Now, that said, FDA also in the proposed rule really doubled down on this notion that it could consider any relevant source of evidence to determine intended use. That standard feels very similar to the totality of the evidence standard that was proposed back in 2017. While it's certainly favorable that the agency stated in the preamble that safe harbor speech will not be considered as part of the intended use determination, that clarification unfortunately does not appear in the regulatory text, so may not provide much comfort. Additionally, as we all know, FDA safe harbors themselves are unclear and not binding. They don't provide manufacturers with clear boundaries to know when something is lawful and when something is not. So all in all, still a lot of problems with the intended use regulation. Some wins, certainly, but the agency continues to take a broad view of intended use. It has significant constitutional implications and may continue to chill manufacturer speech. So what happens next? Well, of course, it remains to be seen whether the agency will finalize the rule, but FDA's position on this intended use does not appear to be politically driven. And in fact, that broad interpretation that we've been talking about in many concepts that appear in the new proposed rule feel very familiar and are reflective of positions taken in the Obama administration. As a result, I don't think we can expect to see a substantive shift in how the government approaches intended use and off-label promotion more generally, even if finalization of the rule doesn't occur right away. But for more context on promotional and other types of enforcement, I'll turn it over to our colleague, Beth.
Thanks, Kelly. So I'm going to talk about enforcement for a few minutes, and I will get to the issues of promotion as well. But I think I'll start with where I think enforcement is likely to be focused in the short term, and maybe the webinar teaser is somewhat misleading because truthfully, I'm not sure enforcement priorities are going to be changing drastically with an administration change, and at least not in the short term while the pandemic is still front and center. We have seen FDA and DOJ focus a lot on COVID-related enforcement for a while, and I think we're going to continue to see more of the same. We will continue to see enforcement around unapproved COVID cures, unapproved and potentially fake imitation vaccines, especially as we get authorization for legitimate vaccines. I think we will likely see enforcement related to COVID-19 tests that don't meet their performance claims, commercial test kits potentially that lack authorization. I think we'll continue to see cases focused on personal protective equipment like masks and gowns that don't meet their promotional claims, hand sanitizers, again, with problematic claims or ingredients. All of these cases are high priority to the agency, and truthfully, they're often pretty easy for the government and DOJ to get behind and to prove. I think there is also the potential, a real possibility that FDA and DOJ will turn increased attention to EUA holders who violate the conditions of authorization in their emergency use authorizations. I think that's especially true with respect to adverse event reporting. We've already seen one such warning letter issued to a holder of an emergency use authorization for a N95 mass decontamination system. That warning letter was focused on the company's allegedly inadequate processes for reporting adverse events and for collecting information and monitoring the performance of the device. And I think this is really key. I think this will continue to transcend administration when we're dealing with products for which there is less evidence of safety and efficacy than with ordinary approvals and clearances. FDA is going to be very focused on adverse event reporting and on evidence of poor performance. And so I think we may see, while we've been sort of focused to date on sort of quack products, I think we may see enforcement turn to EUA authorized products in this context. I think we are also likely to see a flurry of False Claims Act cases focused on FDA regulated products paid for by the government that are defective or flawed in some way. Or perhaps marketed in contravention of the emergency use authorization. Look, there has been a lot of money handed out in procurement contracts related to COVID, and to the extent the products provided are not what they should be, I think we are likely to see enforcement on that front. And look, I think regardless of administration, FDA and DOJ are going to continue to prioritize cases where public health is at risk. I think GMP cases are going to continue and be a focus. I think, we have seen in the Trump administration, we will continue to see in the Biden administration, subpoenas issued where there is concern about manufacturing practices and potential for problematic products to be reaching the market. I also think as FDA turns back to on-site inspections, and look, that may not happen as quickly as FDA had hoped because of rising COVID rates, but FDA will go back to inspecting and will focus its attention on problems it sees when it comes back on site. I'll note that FDA expected that there would be deviations related to the pandemic. And when FDA comes on site, it will be looking to see how those deviations were dealt with, whether they impacted product quality, and whether appropriate documentation is in place, reflecting investigation and remediation arising out of deviations. And FDA issued a recent guidance that sort of sets out a roadmap of what FDA will be looking for when it gets there. Just to talk for a moment about promotion-based cases, marketing-based cases, as Kelly mentioned, the intended use rule seems to be in line with the way the intended use rule has been historically. Certainly was not a bar in the past to FDA looking to take enforcement action for off-label promotion. I think also in the EUA context, the EUAs are chock full of marketing related restrictions that if violated could strip a product of its authorization. I think the question is not really, the question with respect to enforcement is not where FDA can look for evidence of intended use. I think the issue in enforcement is whether DOJ and FDA are going to have the appetite to take on First Amendment challenges. Certainly, the agencies have the ability to look at a wide variety of evidence to look for intended use. But the question is whether or not there is going to be concern about adverse First Amendment decisions in that context. I certainly think we're going to have a DOJ and an FDA prepared to go to bat for the agency's ability to regulate promotional speech. But with the courts changing and becoming more conservative, fear of First Amendment decisions may impact charging strategies. And there is certainly a case that is in the appeal pipeline. I'm talking about the Facto case. I don't have time to really focus on it now, but Robes and Gray issued an alert not long ago about this case. This is a case where convictions for misbranding and adulteration related to off-label promotion were challenged as being based on truthful and non-misleading speech. Those convictions were upheld, summarizing very quickly, because the court found that the crimes were not speech, that speech was simply evidence of crime. So we'll see how courts look at that decision in the future. And the last point I want to turn to is just there's recently been some attention to HHS's withdrawal of FDA's 2006 and 2011 unapproved drug initiative guidances, and question about what kind of impact that's going to have on FDA's enforcement priorities with respect to unapproved new drugs in a new administration. while those guidances sort of set out non-controversial priorities that FDA would look at in terms of taking enforcement action against unapproved new drugs, the controversial part was, FDA's stated intention to clear the market of unapproved drugs that serve as competition for products that come in for new drug approval. Again, FDA was hoping a policy of incentivizing manufacturers of old unapproved drugs to come in for approval, that they could incentivize those approvals by promising to clear the market of competition. There's some evidence that may have led to increased pricing and shortages, and that was HHS's reason for withdrawing these guidances. I mean, obviously, the Biden administration could reflexively reissue these guidances if it chose to do so, though they would have to comply with good guidance practices. I'm not sure the Biden administration will want to do that because of their concern about pricing as well. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Greg, and we can talk more in our next webinar.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. Thanks, Beth. So I'm going to just wrap up a few minutes talking about developments that we might expect with regard to medical devices. So first of all, I mean, we're in, I guess, the midst of a very severe spike, I guess the worst we've had of the whole pandemic. And so I think for the immediate future and probably the near foreseeable to mid foreseeable future, a number of months into next year, I think there's still going to be a continued focus at FDA with regard to availability of testing, availability of PPE, and other medical supplies as we kind of need to bridge towards getting the population vaccinated, which is going to take some time. The Biden administration, or the policies of the candidate Biden had said that he would invest in at-home testing and rapid diagnostic testing. These are topics that FDA has been interested in itself. Of course, I think there'll be push to try to get some more home testing, OTC testing, potentially without a prescription, different kinds of novel tests, and then potentially we'll make greater use of the Defense Production Act to increase production of PPE of various kinds, masks, face shields, and so on. From a legal perspective, one of the issues I find most interesting, and we've spent a lot of time thinking about and advising our clients on, is regarding laboratory developed tests for COVID-19 testing. For those who follow this, there's been quite a controversy, I guess, that has arisen on this topic. The FDA initially in the pandemic said that it would require laboratories that developed COVID-19 tests, diagnostic tests, to obtain emergency use authorization from FDA to be able to use those tests. Ultimately, and so that was sort of the position of the FDA, and most laboratories that we were dealing with were adhering to that, starting from March and February, March of this year. In the end of August, HHS, the parent agency of FDA, came out with a pronouncement saying that no LDTs could be required for any reason, including COVID-19, unless FDA went through notice and comment rulemaking. And there was a legal opinion that eventually circulated in the legal community later that underlay that determination by HHS. Reportedly, this was a decision that was made over the objections of FDA personnel, and there's been continued back and forth between FDA and the agency about now whether test developers can voluntarily submit and FDA will review EUA applications for LDTs, because they want a benefit that you can have from being EUA authorized, which is liability protection under a statute called the PrEP Act. So this is, there's still some push and pull on that. There are unanswered questions about the scope of, what's considered an LDT for this purpose, what things will FDA review and won't. If you're interested in that, there's more information on our website. We have published, Beth and I and others have published a number of client alerts on this topic that go into that in some more detail. But I think what will be interesting in the transition is, how is the Biden administration going to look at all this? Will they come in and reverse the current determination by HHS? That there are some issues with the legal analysis there that I think wouldn't be, there's an ability to do that. Or do they say, look, we're focused on vaccines, we're focused on other things, we're going to leave well enough alone on this topic for now, and then look more long-term towards reform of laboratory developed test regulation generally, which I think if there's one thing that there's a bipartisan consensus on in FDA medical device world, is that there needs to be some agreed upon framework, legislative framework. for LDTs going forward. So that I think is something that will happen. And I think more attention is focused on that now as a result of what's happened with COVID. Another, there's some other issues FDA will have to deal with and sort of eventually unwinding, when we do get COVID-19 under control. They've issued dozens and hundreds of EUAs, and there's all these products that are on the market that came on the market that don't meet typical FDA standards for marketing. That came on under these emergency authorities of the FDA. So how do you unwind all of that? Some products like, PPE and things probably get consumed pretty quickly, so they're not going to be out there long term. But there are other things. There are ventilators. There's systems that have been created to decontaminate masks and other things. There's diagnostic tests, right? So what is the long-term fate of all those products? How does that get handled? I think that's going to be quite a bit of work for the FDA. Another issue is some of the questions that have arisen around the fragility of the supply chain. Why did we have all these shortages? Beth and I have a paper we're working on publishing right now on this topic about, there's the Buy America order now that's been put in place by the Trump administration as an executive order. What's going to happen with those topics under the Trump administration? I'm going to wrap up now, so I won't get into that, what I think about that, but it's going to be interesting. And then ultimately, I think FDA would really be interested in getting back to their regular business. There were a number of things that were on the docket before the pandemic hit, such as medical device safety. There were initiatives that were underway from the Obama administration, some things that were statutorily mandated that FDA has to do, and other things. And so, I think, and we have a reauthorization of user fee statute that's going to be coming up in 2022 that will need to be reauthorized. And so there's going to be legislative work done in anticipation of that. So I think FDA probably is looking forward to being able to refocus some of its energies on its more traditional regulatory priorities. So with that, I'm going to close. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the program, and tune in next week to hear from another group of our Ropes and Gray colleagues on anticipated Department of Justice and SEC enforcement priorities. Thank you again, and have a great day.